Hello and welcome to another TLDR video. Given the global pandemic, it's been a while since we covered all things Brexit, and with the deadline for requesting an extension getting ever closer, we thought it would be time to give you an update on the negotiations. And to be blunt, it looks like the UK and EU are still a long way away from reaching an agreement that everyone's happy with, and some think that the UK might have just given up on the process, focusing on other issues. The EU does seem to have earnestly stuck to it though, so in this video we're going to give you an update on negotiations and try and explain whether the EU actually needs the UK moving forward. Just a quick shout out to our new book, Brexit the Colouring Book. Our book takes you through 15 key moments from the Brexit process, letting you colour the images, as well as reading exactly what happened from beginning to end. Not only is this a colouring book and a nice timeline of the process, but everyone who buys it gets access to an exclusive TLDR video. So even if you're not into colouring, you can support the channel, get yourself a timeline of the process and an exclusive video. Also, for a limited time, we're offering serious introductory discounts, and a link to the store can be found below. We've worked so hard on this book, so a huge thanks for your support. So before we get to the core question of whether the EU still needs the UK, let's discuss the current state of negotiations between the two sides. First things first, having left the EU on the 31st of January, the UK entered a transition period where nothing of substance really changed, but during which a deal on the future relationship was supposed to be reached, based on the legally non-binding political declaration. As things stand, the transition period is set to end on the 31st of December 2020, and if either the UK or EU want to extend it, the joint committee representing both sides would have to adopt a single decision extending the transition period for up to 1 or 2 years, and they have to do this before the 1st of July at a high-level conference. Regardless, despite some calls to extend the transition period given the exceptional circumstances of the pandemic, the UK has consistently remained firm there should be no extension, from the Prime Minister's spokesman insisting that nobody should be in any doubt that the transition period will end on December 31st, to David Frost, the chief negotiator for the UK, telling a Commons committee, "It's the firm policy of the government that we will not extend the transition period, and if asked, we would not agree to it." Anyway, Katja Adler, the BBC's Europe editor, says that the EU Commission is now interpreting the UK's refusal to extend the transition period as definitive, although the concept of smart legal workarounds hasn't been taken off the table. So if both parties at the very end of the transition period want a little extra time, it's possible they might be able to find a way to do it. Regardless, with the UK unwilling to extend, the only way the UK could possibly leave with a deal in the next 6 months is if negotiations go incredibly smoothly from here on out. And again, to be brutally honest, they aren't. With 4 main stumbling blocks appearing again and again: fishing, the level playing field, governance, and the role of EU law in security arrangements. With Michel Barnier claiming that in all areas, the UK continues to backtrack on the commitments it's undertaken in the political declaration. So in order to understand the current state of play and how much the EU wants to deal with the UK, let's take a look at these stumbling blocks in turn, starting with fisheries. Fish have always been a hotly debated topic ever since the referendum campaign, with the common fisheries policy being a key sticking point. Under existing laws, the UK and EU share fishing access, meaning that EU vessels have the right to fish in UK waters, something that's incredibly contentious to some. The UK has consistently advocated that this issue should be split off from the main agreement, publishing a separate draft for the Fisheries Framework Agreement. In a written statement to Parliament by Johnson back in February, he set out in no uncertain terms: the UK will become an independent coastal state at the end of 2020, and any agreement must reflect this reality. The EU, on the other hand, wants to uphold existing reciprocal conditions on access to waters, and the EU, as things stand, is not prepared to de-link the negotiations for a free trade agreement, and that on fisheries, with France being quite explicit that this needs to form a comprehensive agreement. In a statement made by the French Minister of State for European Affairs, affirmed that there must be a fisheries component in the agreement, It's not an issue where we'll tolerate any unilateral decisions. Indeed, fisheries is the most affected, most visible, most iconic sector. We're making an absolute red line. We must protect access to British waters for our fishermen. But all in all, fishing is only a relatively small part of Europe's economy, providing some 180,000 jobs. Then comes the idea of the level playing field, seen as the largest barrier to the agreement. The idea of a level playing field is that the UK and EU will both be bound to a common agreement to ensure that neither side has an unfair advantage in the market. For example, preventing either side from reducing labour or environmental standards in order to get an advantage. The EU is very keen on this idea, but the UK has repeatedly stated that they will not accept measures that go beyond the typical comprehensive free trade agreement. Instead of a full level playing field, the UK has agreed to a watered down form of non regression, where the UK will not weaken its standards in order to get a competitive advantage, but will not necessarily commit to raising its standards if the EU does. However, the EU looks unwilling to budge, insisting that due to geographic proximity, volume of trade, and economic interconnectedness, a special agreement, including a level playing field agreement, is necessary. When it comes to the third stumbling block, governance, the UK wants a suite of agreements, with individual treaty texts for individual areas. A treaty covering free trade, another on fisheries, another on air transport, and so on and so forth. The EU is instead looking for a comprehensive partnership, overseen by a joint EU-UK governing body, the Partnership Council, with the Court of Justice of the European Union intervening if a concept of EU law needs to be interpreted. And finally, the role of EU law when it comes to security really matters. The UK is proposing a separate agreement which must not constrain the UK's legal system in any way, and should not provide any role for the CJEU in resolving UK-EU disputes, or specify how the UK or EU member states protect and enforce human rights and the rule of law within their own autonomous legal systems, i.e., a complete divorce from EU law. The EU, meanwhile, wants a cooperation on law enforcement and judicial cooperation to be conditional on the UK's adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights, as well as continuing UK domestic law, allowing citizens to invoke it in UK courts, i.e., the Human Rights Act of 1998. That's not to say that other issues don't exist. A Commons briefing paper summarising both sides' negotiating positions contains 18 different potential flare points, including the 4 major ones we've just covered. So, with these stumbling blocks continuing to remain firmly in place, and neither side looking willing to budge anytime soon, why are negotiations still going on? Well, firstly, there's the political optics. Neither side can be seen as the one who's giving up on negotiations entirely, but the bigger drive consists on the question of need. And many believe that the EU needs the UK, but this would run counter to the supposedly hardball EU negotiation strategy, which doesn't suggest that the EU is willing to compromise in order to get a deal with the UK. On one hand, the UK is one of the largest economies in Europe, being a hub for financial services and academia. If the EU and UK remained closely aligned through an agreed future relationship framework, the EU could retain its political and economic clout across the world, able to draw on the vast amount of customers and businesses in the UK, without incurring the potential costs of having to redraw business plans and distribution networks again and again. Many businesses across the EU and UK use just-in-time production lines, where frictionless trade is essential. In that regard, ensuring that the UK remains closely aligned, both in terms of the level playing field and trade policy, is a critical issue for a number of European and British businesses. In 2018, the UK exported some £291 billion worth of goods to other EU members, equivalent to 45% of all UK exports, with imports to the value of £357.4 billion, or 52.6% of all UK imports. All in all, the UK has a trade deficit in the region of £66 billion, meaning that more money is going to the EU than from. From a direct contribution point of view, the UK's net contribution to the EU in 2018 was some £8.9 billion, a quite significant chunk of the EU budget, which will have to be filled in one way or another, a gap set to be covered by Germany as the biggest single economy in the coming years. But on the other hand, a UK free EU could focus on deepening the single market, the single currency, and the general ethos of Europe as an ever closer union, which, in the eyes of many, the UK has never really subscribed to. These negotiations have to balance a number of different priorities. The EU, first and foremost, wants to protect the single market, and ideally keep such a politically and economically influential, now former member state closely aligned, ensuring that the EU retains enough political and economic clout globally to move forward and up in the world. If both aren't possible, the EU will ultimately protect its own back, especially in the light of COVID. With countries beginning to open up, politicians across Europe will want to be seen as putting Europe first, while also deterring other future departures. So, what do you think? Does the EU really need the UK? Will a UK free EU be liberated or handicapped? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed this video and want more EU-based content from us, remember that we have a whole separate channel for that. It's TLDR EU, where we not only discuss the Union, but also European topics that affect countries across Europe. You can find a link to that channel below, and be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more updates as we release videos. Special thanks to our Patreon backers, whose support makes videos like this one possible.